The dusty ledger on Silas McCade's desk fluttered its pages, a dry, papery sound that was the loudest thing in the old ranch house. It was April 12th, and a wind from the east, smelling of wet sage and cold Wyoming dirt, pushed through a crack in the kitchen window. It was a promise of spring that felt like a lie. Silas's hand, his knuckles permanently stained the brown of the earth and cracked like the mud in a dried-up creek bed, clenched the pen so tight his fingers ached. He was a big man, 42 years old, built from a lifetime of lifting hay bales and wrestling calves, but right then, he felt as thin and fragile as the paper under his hand. He was signing away the Red Canyon Ranch, 200 acres of land that had been in his family since his great-grandfather, Silas McCade, had homesteaded it back in 1887. The numbers just didn't work anymore. 2 bad winters in a row, the price of beef falling, a loan he'd taken to fix the north pasture fence after a storm. It all added up to one final number at the bottom of the bank's letter. A number he couldn't reach. The silence in the house was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the sound of emptiness. No clatter from his mother's old kitchen, no radio playing the weather report, no sound of another person breathing. Just the endless, tired groan of the windmill bearing outside. Creak squeak asterisk. A sound like a tired animal that refused to lay down and die. He looked at the name he was about to sign. Silas James McCade. It felt like writing his own name on a tombstone. This was the last normal moment. Or at least, the last moment of the only life he'd ever known. The hairline fracture in that reality wasn't just the debt. It was the tremor in his own hand. A faint, shaking vibration that made the S in Silas wobble. This was a hand that could rope a runaway steer, could pull a newborn calf into the world, could split firewood for hours. But it couldn't hold steady to write the words that would end everything. His body itself was refusing to surrender. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and old wood. He could smell the faint, familiar scent of coffee from the pot he'd made 6 hours ago, gone stale and bitter. He lowered the pen. The black tip hovered over the dotted line. And then, a new sound cut through the wind and the windmill's moan. It was the crunch of gravel. Not the slow scatter of tumbleweed or the scamper of a jackrabbit. This was the sharp, deliberate crunch of car tires rolling slowly up his long, neglected driveway. A sound that didn't belong. His head came up. His spine went straight. Nobody came out here anymore. The mail came 3 times a week, and that was it. He heard the car door open, then shut with a solid asterisk thump star. Footsteps approached, not the heavy bootfalls of a rancher, but lighter, quicker steps. They came up onto the porch. The old wood planks, warped from sun and snow, gave a familiar groan. Silas didn't move. He just stared at the screen door, its mesh grey and dotted with dead flies from last summer. A shadow filled the rectangle of light. Then, a knock. 3 sharp, polite raps. Silas finally pushed his chair back, the leg scraping against the worn pine floor with a sound that made him wince. He walked to the door, his boots heavy. He didn't open it right away. He looked through the screen. A woman stood there. She was maybe in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She wasn't dressed for the country. She wore a neat, light blue jacket and trousers, and city shoes that were already dusted with the fine, red powder of his driveway. She held a small leather folder in her hands. But what hit him first wasn't her appearance. It was the smell. A clean, sharp scent of lemon and something else, something floral, like perfume. It cut through the dusty air of his porch like a knife. It was the smell of somewhere else. "Can I help you?" Silas said, his voice rough from disuse. "Mr. Silas McCade." Her voice was clear, polite. "That's me. My name is Elise Carter. I'm from the firm that manages the Heritage Trust. May I come in for a moment? It's about your property." Silas unlatched the door, the spring letting out a long, tired twang. She stepped inside, and her city scent filled the front room, mixing uneasily with the smells of old leather, wood smoke, and coffee. She looked around, not with judgment, he thought, but with a kind of intense curiosity. Her eyes took in the stone fireplace, the sagging bookshelf, the faded rug his grandmother had woven. "I won't take much of your time," she said, opening the leather folder. She pulled out a single sheet of crisp, white paper. "I understand you are in default on your loan with First Territorial Bank." Silas's jaw tightened. He just gave a single, slow nod. "The Heritage Trust has a unique offer. A last-chance option, you might say." She held the paper out to him. "We have a benefactor, someone who values the preservation of historic working ranches like this one. They are willing to restructure your debt, to pay off the bank, and provide a 2-year operating grant. Enough to get you back on your feet." Silas felt the room tilt. It was like hearing water mentioned in a desert. He took the paper, the smoothness of it foreign against his rough skin. He scanned the lines of legal text. The numbers were there. Real numbers. Numbers that could save the Red Canyon. "What's the catch?" he asked, his eyes still on the paper. Elise Carter took a small breath. "The grant and the restructuring are contingent on the ranch being a stable, family-run operation. The trust studies show single-owner ranches in this situation have an 82% failure rate within 5 years. A partnership, a family unit, it shows longevity." Silas looked up from the paper, his blue eyes meeting her calm, brown ones. "I don't have a partner. It's just me. Has been for 10 years, since my dad passed." She nodded, as if she already knew. "The terms require a spouse, Mr. McCade. A legal marriage. It demonstrates commitment to a lasting future for the land." Silas stared at her. He actually let out a short, humorless laugh. "A wife? You're offering me money if I get a *wife*? Is this a joke?" "It is not a joke," she said, her voice still professional, but a flicker of something else, maybe embarrassment, maybe determination, crossed her face. "The paperwork is all there. The trust would need to see a marriage certificate filed with the county clerk by 1 week from today, April 19th. If that condition is met, the funds are released immediately, and the Red Canyon Ranch is secure." She placed the leather folder on his desk, next to the dusty, open ledger. "The terms require a wife, Mr. McCade," she said again, her voice quiet but clear in the silent room. Then she turned and walked back to the door. She paused, her hand on the frame. "I'll be at the Mountain View Motel in town, room 11, until tomorrow afternoon if you have questions." And then she was gone, her footsteps receding, the car door thumping shut, the engine starting, and the crunch of gravel fading away. Silas was left alone again with the groan of the windmill and the smell of her lemon and flower scent slowly fading from the air. He looked from the bank's ledger, full of numbers of loss, to the crisp white paper, full of numbers of hope. A week. He had 1 week to find a wife. The grandfather clock in the hall, a piece his mother had loved, hadn't chimed in over a decade. But its long, wooden pendulum still swung behind the glass door, back and forth, back and forth. Tick. Tack. Measuring the seconds he had left to make a choice that felt less like salvation and more like a different kind of surrender. Who was this stranger, and what kind of person would agree to such a deal? The question hung in the dusty air, unanswered. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, smelled of lemon-scented floor polish and old radiators. It was April 19th, just before noon. Silas McCade stood stiffly in a small, wood-paneled room, wearing the only suit he owned, a dark grey one that felt tight across his shoulders and smelled faintly of mothballs from the back of his closet. The fabric itched his neck. Beside him stood Elise Carter. She wore a simple, cream-coloured dress, nothing fancy. It had a small, repeating pattern of tiny blue flowers on the collar. She held a small bouquet of grocery store daisies wrapped in crinkly green plastic. Her hands were perfectly still. A county clerk, a woman named Darla with kind eyes behind large glasses, smiled at them from behind a desk. "All right, you two. Ready to make it official?" Silas just nodded. His mouth was dry. This whole thing felt like a dream, the kind where you're watching yourself from far away. He'd driven into town 2 days after Elise's visit, found the Mountain View Motel, and knocked on the door of room 11. The Mountain View was just a view of the hardware store's back wall, and the room had smelled of stale cigarette smoke and disinfectant. She'd opened the door, already looking like she'd been expecting him. "I'll do it," he'd said, not stepping inside. "But it's just for the papers. For the land." She'd nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand. It's just a contract, Mr. McCade." And now, here they were. The ceremony was a blur of words. Darla's gentle voice sang phrases like "in sickness and in health," and "for as long as you both shall live." The words echoed in the quiet room, feeling enormous and completely disconnected from the two people standing there. When it came time for the vows, Silas repeated the words in a low, rough voice, his eyes fixed on a knot in the wood paneling behind Darla's head. Then it was Eliza's turn. Her voice was clear and steady, not a single waver. She said the words like she was reading a recipe, precise and calm. Darla beamed. "You may now kiss the bride." A heavy silence filled the room. Silas's heart thumped once, hard, against his ribs. He turned slowly toward Elise. She looked up at him, her face a calm mask. He saw a tiny, almost invisible flicker in her brown eyes. Not fear, but something like resolve. He leaned in, just slightly, and gave her the briefest, dry kiss on the cheek. His lips brushed against skin that was soft and smelled of soap. It lasted less than a second. "Wonderful," Darla said, pretending not to notice the awkwardness. "Sign here, and here." They both signed the marriage certificate. Silas's signature was the same shaky one from the ledger. Eliza's was smooth and flowing, all loops and confidence. Darla stamped it with a loud asterisk thwack asterisk and handed them the fancy copy. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. McCade. Best of luck to you both." They walked out of the courthouse into the weak spring sunshine. The wind caught Eliza's dress, fluttering the hem. They stood on the steps for a moment, not looking at each other. The contract was signed. The ranch was saved. Silas should have felt relief, a weight lifting. Instead, he felt a heavier, stranger weight settling onto his shoulders. "I'll follow you back," Elise said, her keys already in her hand. She had a small, practical sedan, silver and dusty from the ranch road. The drive back to Red Canyon was the longest 20 miles of Silas's life. In his rearview mirror, he could see the glint of her car following steadily. With every mile, the reality pressed in on him. He had a wife. A stranger was coming to live in his quiet, empty house. They arrived. He pulled his truck up near the barn. She parked beside him. The only sounds were the wind and that same old windmill. She got out, holding a single small suitcase and a cardboard box. She looked at the house, the barn, the endless stretch of land and sky. "I'll take the guest room," she said. It wasn't a question. "Right," Silas said. "This way." He led her inside. The house felt different with her in it. Smaller. Every sound she made was loud. The click of her suitcase wheels on the floor. The rustle of her jacket as she took it off. He showed her the small room at the back of the house. It had a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window looking out toward the old cottonwood tree. It was clean, but it was sparse. "Thank you," she said. She didn't seem upset by it. That first evening was a quiet, painful dance. Silas cooked dinner, eggs and bacon, because it was easy. They ate at the kitchen table, the only sounds the scrape of forks on plates and the hum of the refrigerator. He tried to think of something, anything, to say. "So, you're from the trust?" he finally asked. "I was their field agent for this region," she said, neatly cutting a piece of egg. "I no longer work for them." That surprised him. "You quit." "The arrangement required it," she said simply. "Conflict of interest." Silas didn't know what to say to that. They finished eating in silence. She got up and washed her plate in the sink. The sound of the water, the clink of the plate on the metal rack, they were sounds from another world, a world of other people, of families. They weren't his sounds. Later, after the sun had set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Silas couldn't sit still in the house. He slipped out the back door, the screen door slapping softly behind him. The night air was cold, biting through his shirt. He walked to the barn, the one place that always felt like his. Inside, it was dark and warm, smelling sweetly of hay and horses. His old mare, Bella, whickered softly from her stall. He ran a hand down her neck, finding comfort in her solid, familiar warmth. He needed to hide the certificate. The thought came to him suddenly, clearly. This piece of paper was the key to everything, but having it in the house, where she might see it, felt wrong. It was a business document, not a wedding photo. He needed to put it with the other tools of his trade, not the memories of his life. In the corner of the barn, under a worn saddle blanket, was a loose floorboard. He'd found it as a kid. He pried it up with his pocket knife. The space beneath was dark and smelled of dry earth. He pulled out the marriage certificate, its fancy paper seeming ridiculous here in the dusty barn. Next to it, he placed another object he'd brought from the house, his father's old branding iron, the letter M for McCade, its metal cool and heavy. He looked at the two objects lying side by side in the dirt. One was a promise of family and forever. The other was a mark of ownership, of hard work, of legacy. They had nothing in common. He placed the floorboard back over them and tamped it down with his boot heel. "It's just a contract," he muttered to the empty barn, to Bella, to himself. The words hung in the hay-scented air, trying to sound true. He slept fitfully that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. A floorboard creaking. The soft sigh of the pipes. He got up before dawn, as usual. The house was silent. He made coffee, the ritual grounding him. He drank a cup, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to a soft grey. Where was she? Still asleep, probably. A city person. He pulled on his coat and went out to do the morning chores. The air had a sharp bite to it. He fed the horses, checked the water troughs. As he walked toward the broken corral on the west side, a project he'd been putting off for months, he saw a figure. It was Elise. She wasn't in her city clothes. She was wearing a pair of his old, discarded work pants, rolled up at the ankles, and one of his flannel shirts over her own. Her hair was tied back with a piece of baling twine. And she was working. The top rail of the corral fence had split during the last winter storm. It was a job that required pulling out the old, splintered wood and nailing in a new post and rail. Silas had been meaning to get to it. Elise had already wrestled the broken rail mostly free. Her hands, which had looked so soft and clean at the courthouse, were now smeared with dirt and sap. He watched, hidden by the corner of the barn, as she tried to fit the end of a new post into the hole. It was too heavy for her. She strained, her face set in concentration, but it slipped, thudding to the ground. She didn't give up. She knelt, grabbed a coiled length of baling wire from the ground, and started trying to lash the broken pieces together as a temporary fix. It was the wrong way to do it. It would never hold. But she was trying. Her city shoes were caked in the thick, red mud of the corral. Silas stood very still. The early morning light caught the fine hairs that had escaped her ponytail, turning them to gold. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt. She wasn't just waiting in the house. She wasn't just a signature on a paper. She was out here, in the cold morning, trying to mend something that was broken. Why? The question hit him like a physical thing. Why would she do that? This was the deal. Sign the paper, live in the house, save the ranch. Mending fences wasn't part of the contract. He felt the solid ground of his understanding of the situation, that this was a simple, cold transaction, begin to crack and shift beneath his feet. He didn't go over to help her. He didn't know what to say. He just turned and walked quietly back to the barn. The image of her struggling with that wire burned into his mind. The sun was fully up now, warming his back. A new day had begun on the Red Canyon Ranch, and nothing was as simple as it had seemed the day before. The first hard winter came early to Red Canyon. It started in late November, not with gentle snowflakes, but with a howling wind that screamed down from the mountains and dumped 2 feet of dry, powdery snow in a single night. By mid-December, the world was reduced to a blanket of white under a sky the color of iron. The windmill's groan was muffled now, buried under the constant whisper of wind over snowdrifts. Inside the house, a new rhythm had slowly, awkwardly, taken hold. Silas and Elise moved around each other like two planets in a small solar system, careful of each other's gravity. She had taken over the kitchen, surprising him with meals that were more than just fuel, stews that simmered all day, filling the house with the smell of herbs and warmth. She'd organized the chaotic pile of bills on his desk into neat, labeled folders. In return, he'd shown her how to safely feed the horses in a blizzard, how to check the water heaters in the troughs so they wouldn't freeze. They didn't talk much, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the empty silence of before. It was a silence often filled with useful work. She would be mending a torn saddle blanket by the fire. He would be sharpening tools at the table. The only sound would be the crackle of the fire and the steady scrape of his file on metal. It was almost peaceful. But the peace was fragile. The debt was gone, thanks to the trust's money, but running the ranch was a daily battle against the cold and the cost of everything. Silas could feel the pressure like a constant low ache in his bones. On the morning of December 18th, a day so cold the snow squeaked underfoot, a black SUV with tinted windows crawled up the plowed track of the driveway. Silas saw it from the barn window, his breath making frosty clouds on the glass. A man in a long, expensive wool coat got out, briefcase in hand. It was Mr. Thorne, the lawyer from the Heritage Trust. But he wasn't alone. A second man, younger, in a sleek ski jacket, followed him, pointing a small video camera at the barn, the house, the land. Silas met them at the porch, pulling his work coat tighter. "Thorne, didn't expect you in this weather." "Due diligence, Silas, due diligence," Thorne said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The younger man filmed Silas's weathered face. "Just a routine visit to see how our investment is faring. And to meet the lucky Mrs. McCade." Elise appeared in the doorway then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She saw Thorne and the camera, and for just a second, Silas saw her posture stiffen, her friendly mask slipping into something more cautious. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice level. "Elise. Or should I say, Mrs. McCade." Thorne boomed, stepping inside without being asked. He brought the cold air in with him. "You're looking well. Ranch life agrees with you." The visit was a cold, clinical inspection disguised as a friendly chat. Thorne asked about feed stores, about the herd count, about winter preparations. The cameraman panned slowly around the main room, lingering on the two chairs by the fire, the two placemats on the table. Silas felt like an animal in a zoo exhibit. He gave short, gruff answers. Then Thorne dropped the first stone into the still water. "You know, this whole valley is changing," he said, sipping the coffee Elise had silently offered. "Big agricultural groups are buying up parcels. Consolidated Grazing, out of Denver. They've made offers on 3 properties just east of here. They're talking about a meat processing plant over near Casper. Would be a boon for sellers." Silas's coffee turned bitter in his mouth. "The Red Canyon isn't for sale." Of course not, Thorne said smoothly. "Not while you're a thriving family operation. That's what our grant is for. To ensure * legacy star." He said the word like it was for sale in a store. He stood up to leave, pulling on his leather gloves. "You're a fortunate man, Silas, to have found such a suitable partner. Just in time." After they left, the house felt colder than before. The tracks of the SUV were 2 black wounds in the perfect white of the driveway. Silas stood at the window, a knot of anger and dread tight in his stomach. It wasn't a friendly visit. It was a reminder, a show of power. The real storm hit a week later, on Christmas Eve. It was a true Wyoming blizzard, a whiteout that rattled the windows and piled snow up to the porch rail. In the barn, Bella, Silas's old mare, was in trouble. She was colicking, a terrible pain in her gut. She was sweating, pacing her stall, looking at her sides, kicking at her belly. Silas was in a panic. A colic in this weather, with the vet impossible to reach, could be a death sentence. He tried all the old remedies, walking her, giving her the medicine he had on hand. But his own fear made him rough, impatient. His movements were jerky, his voice a tense command. "Stand, girl, stand still." Bella only grew more agitated, rolling her eyes white with pain and fear. Elise had followed him to the barn. She'd been quiet, just watching from the stall door. Now, as Silas fought to keep the mare from lying down and twisting her gut further, Elise stepped forward. "Let me try," she said, her voice calm against the howl of the wind outside. "You don't know anything about horses," Silas snapped, frustration boiling over. "I know about fear," she said simply. She didn't wait for permission. She moved past him into the stall. She didn't grab Bella's halter. Instead, she just started talking. Not baby talk, just a low, steady murmur. "It's all right. It's just the wind. It's just a pain, and it will pass." Her voice was a ribbon of calm in the chaotic storm of the barn. She placed a hand, not on Bella's head, but gently on her sweat-damp neck. She just stood there, breathing slowly, her own body relaxed. And slowly, ever so slowly, Bella stopped her frantic pacing. The mare's head lowered slightly. She let out a great, shuddering sigh, her hot breath fogging in the cold air. Elise kept talking, her hand making slow, gentle circles. She nodded to Silas, and he quietly handed her the lead rope. For the next hour, in the dim, stormlit barn, Elise walked the mare in slow, patient circles. Her touch was sure. Her voice never wavered. Silas watched, leaning against the stall door, feeling something inside him crack open. He saw it then, clear as day. The mirror moment. He saw a man who thought strength was force, who thought solitude was power. He saw a man who was ready to lose everything because he only knew how to push, not how to soothe. And he saw her, a woman who had walked into a strange life and was facing a storm, both outside and in, with a quiet, stubborn patience he didn't understand. He felt a surge of shame, and then a stranger, softer feeling, awe. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. They were trapped together, but the space between them had shifted. He found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a growing curiosity. On the 3rd morning, the snow had stopped. The sun was a blinding glare off a world of white. As Silas shoveled a path to the barn, he found a manila envelope, half buried in a snowdrift near the porch. It had McCade typed on the front. It must have fallen from Thorne's briefcase during his visit. His fingers were numb as he tore it open. Inside was not trust paperwork. It was a proposal from Consolidated Grazing, addressed to him. An offer to buy the Red Canyon Ranch. The number was high, startlingly high. Enough to set him up comfortably somewhere else, somewhere easier. Scrawled in pen at the bottom was a note from Thorne, * a quiet, lucrative exit if the partnership proves inconvenient. The offer is good until spring. Discreet, of course. * An impossible choice, right there in his freezing hands. Take the money, dissolve the paper marriage, walk away from the endless struggle. Or stay, tied to a stranger and a debt of gratitude, fighting a battle that might break him anyway. That night, the house was quiet, the kind of deep quiet that only comes after a storm. Elise was already in her room. Silas sat at the desk, the ugly buyout offer in front of him. Next to it, he finally opened the old, dusty ledger. He hadn't looked at it since the day she arrived. He flipped through the pages of his failures. And then he stopped. On the page for October, in his own messy scrawl, were his notes on hay consumption and costs. But in the margin, in a different ink, a neat, blue pen, were new notes. * try alfalfa mix from Jensen's, 5% cheaper per bale. * on the November page, next to his note about the truck's oil change, she had written, * scheduled next service for January 15th, called garage. * She had been tending to his business, quietly, competently. Not just mending fences, but mending his chaotic life. He turned another page. And there, tucked into the crease of the ledger, he found it. A small, perfect sketch of a Wyoming Indian paintbrush, the red wildflower that bloomed on the hillsides in June. It was drawn in careful pencil, every detail tenderly captured. It was a drawing of something beautiful, something that belonged here, made by her hand. He sat back in his chair, the cold from the window seeping into his back. The buyout offer promised freedom. The sketch promised nothing at all, just a moment of noticed beauty. He looked from the corporate letterhead to the delicate pencil lines, and then Silas McCade realized the marriage license was a lie. This wasn't a business arrangement anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Somewhere in the shared silence, the mended fences, the cared-for animals, and the sketched wildflower, something real had taken root, and he was only just now seeing it for what it was. The envelope from Consolidated Grazing sat on Silas's desk for a week, a silent, poisonous thing. Every time he walked into the room, he felt its presence, like a cold draft from a hidden crack. He didn't tell Elise about it. His old, solitary habit of carrying burdens alone clamped down on him, hard and fast. But this time, the silence didn't feel strong. It felt like a cage. He waited for a clear morning in early January, when the sky was a sharp, brittle blue. He told Elise he was going into Cedar Ridge for parts. It was only half a lie. He drove straight past the hardware store and parked in front of the modest, clapboard office of the Cedar Ridge Sentinel *, the town's weekly newspaper. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in, bringing the smell of cold air and ink with him. The editor, Frank Bell, was a man in his 70s who had known Silas's father. He looked up from a messy desk, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Silas McCade. To what do I owe the honor? You placing an ad for some cattle. Not today, Frank, Silas said, his voice low. He didn't sit. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out 2 documents. The first was the weathered marriage certificate from under the barn floorboard. The second was a new piece of paper he had typed himself on his old typewriter the night before. At the top, it read, Red Canyon Ranch Partnership Agreement. It listed the partners as Silas James McCade and Elise Marie McCade. He'd signed his name. Next to hers, he'd left a blank line. He laid them both on Frank's desk. I need these notarized. And then, I need you to keep a copy. For the record. Frank picked up the marriage certificate, whistling softly through his teeth. Heard you'd got hitched. Congratulations are in order, I suppose. Then he looked at the partnership deed. His bushy eyebrows rose. This is new. You two going into business official-like. Something like that, Silas said, meeting Frank's gaze. He was using his silence, his ingrained stubbornness, as a weapon now. Not against the world, but for something. To create proof. To build a wall around what was his, and hers. I'd appreciate it if you didn't spread it around just yet. Frank nodded slowly, understanding more than Silas was saying. He stamped both documents with his notary seal with 2 firm *thump star. For the record, he said, handing Silas the originals and placing copies in his own filing cabinet. The sound of the metal drawer closing was final. Back at the ranch, a change had begun. It was subtle, like the first hint of green under the melting snow. Silas didn't announce anything. He just started acting differently. The next day, he went to the long-neglected south pasture. The fence there was a snarl of wire and rotten posts, a job he'd avoided for 2 years because it was too big for one man. He simply started. He loaded tools into the buckboard wagon, hitched up the team, and began pulling out the old posts with a chainsaw and sheer muscle. An hour into the work, sweating despite the cold, he saw a figure walking across the field toward him. Elise. She was bundled in a coat and scarf, carrying 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to him without a word. Hot coffee, strong and sweet just how he liked it. Thought you could use this, she said. He nodded his thanks, the steam warming his face. He took a long drink, then gestured with the mug toward a pile of new fence posts. Could use a hand setting these, if you're of a mind to. She looked at the posts, then at him, a question in her eyes. This wasn't in the contract. This was an ask. She simply set her coffee down on a flat rock, pulled on the work glove she had tucked in her pocket, and said, "Show me how." That afternoon, they worked in parallel lines. He dug the holes, deep and straight. She followed, holding the new cedar posts steady while he packed the dirt and gravel tied around them. They didn't talk much. Just the sound of the shovel biting into the earth, the grunt of effort, the call of crows overhead. But it was a shared silence, filled with purpose. He'd glance over and see her, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her breath making little clouds as she concentrated on holding the post true. Something tight in his chest, something that had been clenched for years, began to ease. Weeks passed this way. They fixed the south pasture fence. They cleaned out the old carving shed together, filling a trailer with decades of junk. They planned the spring planting for a small vegetable garden near the house, Elise marking the rows on a paper sketch. The partnership deed in Frank's filing cabinet was a fiction, but the partnership on the land was becoming a daily fact. Then, in late March, the notice came. The annual spring land auction and county meeting was scheduled for April 10th at the Grange Hall. This year, the buzz in town was all about consolidated grazing. Rumor was they were going to make a public, sweeping offer for all the underutilized land in the valley, aiming to bundle properties together. It was a bully's tactic, meant to scare people into selling. The night before the auction, the air in the ranch house was thick with unspoken words. Silas sat at the table, cleaning his grandfather's old rifle, not because he needed it, but because the rhythmic action of oiling the metal helped him think. Elise was at the sink, washing dishes. The only sounds were the clink of plates and the soft asterisk shush shush asterisk of the cloth on metal. "You're going tomorrow," she said, not a question. "I have to," Silas replied, looking down the rifle's barrel at the lamplight. "I know." She turned, drying her hands on a towel. She looked at him, her expression serious. "Silas, whatever happens, this place, it's worth the fight." He stopped, the oily rag still in his hand. It was the first time she'd ever said anything like that. The first time she'd ever called the ranch this place with a tone that sounded like home. The Grange Hall on April 10th was packed, stuffy, and loud. The smell of old wood, coffee, and damp wool coats filled the air. Ranchers and neighbors filled the folding chairs, their faces etched with worry. At the front of the room, a portable podium was set up. Mr. Thorne was there, looking polished and confident, standing with a man in a sleek suit, the representative from Consolidated Grazing. Silas stood at the back, leaning against the wall. He wore his same old work jacket. He felt every eye on him, knowing his story, his marriage of convenience, the grant that saved him. He felt like a man about to be exposed as a fraud. The auctioneer ran through some small parcels of land. Then, Thorne stepped to the podium. He gave a smooth speech about progress, about economic opportunity, about the future. Then he introduced the man from Denver. The man announced Consolidated Grazing's Valley Consolidation offer. The number he named for each acre was high, seductive. A murmur, a mix of excitement and dread, rippled through the crowd. The man finished by saying, "We are prepared to sign letters of intent today, with a substantial bonus for those who commit." It was a stampede in the making. People were looking at each other, doing mental math, looking at the tired lines on their own hands. Silas saw it happening. He saw the history of the valley, the families, the individual stories, about to be erased for a single, corporate check. Then the auctioneer spoke up. "Before we move on, we have any existing property matters? Disputes? Updates?" A heavy silence fell. This was the moment. Silas's mouth was dry as dust. He felt the weight of his own solitude, his instinct to stay against the wall and say nothing. But then he thought of the south pasture fence, standing straight and new. He thought of a sketched wildflower in a ledger. He thought of her voice saying, "Asterisk, it's worth the fight. Asterisk." He pushed himself off the wall. Every head in the room turned. His boots were loud on the wooden floor as he walked to the front. He could feel Thorne's surprised, then calculating, stare. He ignored the podium and turned to face the crowd of his neighbors. Their faces were a blur. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the notarized marriage certificate and the partnership deed. He held them up, not to the crowd, but to Thorne and the man from Denver. "My wife and I aren't selling," he said, his voice rough but clear, cutting through the quiet. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact, solid as stone. The room was utterly still. Then, a slow, building wave of sound started. Murmurs, shifting chairs, a few low whistles. Thorne's confident smile had frozen, then melted into something cold and hard. The man from Denver looked confused, then irritated. Thorne stepped forward. His voice a low hiss meant only for Silas. "That's a lovely document, Silas. But a marriage license and a homemade deed don't override a legitimate business offer. This is a matter for lawyers now. And we both know what that paper is really worth." The confrontation had begun. The final action was poised to unfold. All the lies, the truth, the pretend partnership and the real one, were about to collide right there in the stuffy Grange hall, under the fluorescent lights that hummed like a held breath. What would Thorne do next? And what could Silas possibly say to prove that the life he was fighting for was real? The fluorescent lights in the Grange hall hummed like a nest of angry bees. The silence after Silas's words was so deep he could hear the rustle of his own papers in his hand. Mr. Thorne's face had tightened, his polite mask gone. The man from Consolidated Grazing just looked impatient, like he'd hit a technical glitch he needed to delete. "A homemade deed isn't a legal document, McCade," Thorne said, his voice loud enough for the front rows to hear. "This is a serious forum. Your marital arrangement with a former trust employee is already a matter of some scrutiny. Don't make a public spectacle." The word spectacle hung in the air. Silas felt the heat of 100 stares on the back of his neck. He was a rancher, not a public speaker. The words he needed were stuck somewhere deep in his chest, trapped behind a lifetime of quiet. He looked at the marriage certificate, the fancy script now seeming foolish. Thorne was right. It was just a piece of paper from a strange, quiet day that felt a lifetime ago. Then, a new sound cut through the tension. The heavy wooden door of the Grange hall creaked open. A shaft of April sunlight spilled across the scuffed floor, and in it stood Elise. She wasn't dressed for town. She wore her work clothes, old jeans, Silas's too-big flannel shirt, her boots dusty from the ranch yard. Her hair was coming loose from its ponytail. She must have driven like the wind to get here. She stood there for a second, blinking in the dim light, looking for him. Then her eyes found his at the front of the room. She didn't hesitate. She walked down the center aisle, her boot steps firm and steady on the old wood. The entire crowd watched her, a sea of turned heads. She walked right past Thorne and stopped beside Silas. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at him, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, clear determination. She gently took the partnership deed from his stiff fingers. She looked at the blank line next to where he'd signed his name. Then, she reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and pulled out a pen. It was a simple blue ballpoint. Right there, in front of everyone, she leaned the deed against her own steady hand and signed her name. Elise Marie McCade. Her signature, smooth and flowing, filled the empty space. She handed the pen to Silas, her fingers brushing his. It was the same pen, he realized with a jolt, that she used to make notes in the ledger, to sketch wildflowers in the margins. Then she turned to face Thorne and the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and carried to the back walls. "The deed might be homemade, Mr. Thorne, but the partnership is not. I've lived on the Red Canyon for a year. I've mended its fences in the rain. I've calmed its scared animals in a blizzard. I've planted a garden by its kitchen door. My name is on the mortgage payment we sent last month, from our joint account at First Territorial." She took a small step closer to the podium, her gaze unwavering. "You can question our paperwork, but you don't get to question my work, or my home." A ripple went through the crowd. A few people nodded. An old rancher near the front, Gus Peterson, spoke up in his gravelly voice. "She helped my boy fix a flat on the county road last month. In the snow. Seems like a neighbor to me." Another voice chimed in. "She buys feed from my store every other week. Always asks about my grandkids." It wasn't a legal argument. It was something stronger. It was the testimony of a life being lived, day by day, season by season. Thorne looked from Eliza's set face to the murmuring crowd. He saw his clean, corporate narrative crumbling into the messy, human reality of a community. The man from Denver leaned over and whispered something sharply in Thorne's ear, then shook his head, gathering his papers. The sale, here today, was falling apart. They needed willing sellers, not a public feud. Thorne's shoulders slumped, just a little. The fight went out of him. He gave a stiff, small nod, more of a dismissal than anything, and turned away. Silas didn't see him leave. He was looking at Elise. The noise of the room, the buzz of conversation starting up again, faded into a distant hum. In that moment, he saw her, really saw her, not as the stranger from the porch or the partner in a deal, but as the woman who had chosen to stand beside him in a crowded room and call his struggle her own. They drove home in his truck together, the silence between them now a comfortable, spacious thing. The world outside was caught in that magic hour of late afternoon, the sun painting the melting snowdrifts in shades of gold and pink. When they pulled up to the ranch, the old windmill greeted them with its familiar asterisk creak squeak star. But today, it didn't sound tired. It sounded steady, like a heartbeat. A year passed. A full cycle of seasons turned over the Red Canyon. It was a bright June morning, the air warm and smelling of sage and turned earth. The chipped blue door of the Homestead, which had been faded and peeling for a decade, was now a deep rust red. Silas had painted it himself one weekend in May. The color chosen from a chip Elise had brought home from the hardware store. It gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, on the old desk, the ledger lay open. It was no longer a record of looming loss. The columns for spring were filled with numbers in two different inks, his blocky black pencil, her neat blue pen. They detailed new calves, the sale of hay to a neighbor, the cost of paint for the door. Pressed between the pages for the month of June was not a sketch, but a real, dried Wyoming Indian paintbrush, its vibrant red petals preserved perfectly. It had bloomed by the new garden fence. Silas closed the ledger gently, ran his hand over its worn leather cover, and walked outside. The sun warmed his shoulders. From the corral, he heard a soft laugh. He walked over and leaned on the top rail of the fence they had rebuilt together. Inside, Elise was working with a new colt, a skittish little bay with wide, dark eyes. She held the lead rope loose, talking to him in that same low, steady murmur. Easy now. Just walking. Nobody's hurrying. The colt's ears flicked forward, listening, and he settled into a calm walk beside her. Silas watched them, a feeling of deep, quiet contentment settling in his chest. It wasn't a loud happiness. It was the solid feeling of a fence post set deep in good soil. It was the peace of a chore finished at the end of a long day. It was the warmth of knowing you weren't alone in the quiet anymore. Elise looked up and saw him. She didn't stop what she was doing, but a smile touched her eyes, a smile just for him. The late sun streamed across the corral, and from where Silas stood, the shadows stretched out long behind them, not two separate shapes, but one joined silhouette, falling across the solid, mended wood of the fence and the rich, promising earth of the Red Canyon Ranch. The story of how a lie became a truth was theirs alone. It wasn't written in any legal document. It was written in the rhythm of their shared days, in the silent language of a job done side by side, and in the simple, profound courage it takes to build something real, one honest day at a time.